They call this place Lusatia, a quiet corner of eastern Germany, forests, rivers, old cobblestone streets. At first glance, nothing unusual. The signs read Botzen, Budison, Koppes, Chosbus. 2 names, 2 languages, one unmistakably German, the other, a tongue few Germans can even recognize. It's called Sorbian, the language of a people many believe no longer exist. And yet here they are. Shopkeepers chatting in Sorbian beneath medieval arches. Children singing ancient Slavic hymns in candlelit churches. A living Slavic tribe, not in Poland, not in the Balkans, but right here, in the heart of modern Germany. How? That is the question that haunts historians, and now geneticists. Because this is no ordinary tale of cultural survival. The Sorbs, as they call themselves, have lived here for nearly 15 centuries, through the rise and fall of empires, through forced conversions, Germanization, and war. And yet their language, their customs, even their bloodlines endure. But there's a darker side to this story. During the Nazi era, an entire campaign was waged to erase them. Official documents declared, the Sorbs do not exist. Their schools were closed, their books burned, their leaders imprisoned. Families were forced to hide their identity, even change their names, just to survive. So how is it possible that after all of this they remain? Not just in whispered stories or half-remembered songs, but in their very DNA. Because as modern science would soon discover, buried within the genetic code of this forgotten tribe, lies a truth that no regime could silence. A truth we are only beginning to understand. But what does their DNA truly reveal about the tribe that Germany tried to forget? It begins farther east than you might think, beyond the forests of Lusatia, past the Elbe, past even the Oder. 15 centuries ago, from the shadowed passes of the Carpathians, a wave of Slavic tribes began to move. Not invaders, not conquerors, but settlers. Among them, a people known as the Lusatia and the Mulcini. Their journey would carve an unexpected legacy across the map of Europe. By the early Middle Ages, their villages dotted lands that today belong to Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic. Not borderlands, heartlands. In those days, these Sorbian ancestors ruled their own domains, lords of rivers and fertile plains, builders of wooden fortresses. An empire? No, but a network of Slavic enclaves that stretched farther west than most imagine today. And then the tide shifted. Germanic expansion pushed east. Fortresses fell. Borders blurred. The Slavic realm began to shrink. Yet even now, beneath centuries of conquest, something remains. Modern science has traced it in the blood. When researchers mapped the DNA of Sorbian descendants, they found an unmistakable kinship. Their closest genetic cousins? Not Germans, not Danes or Dutch, but Poles and Czechs. Their blood still whispers of that ancient migration of a time before modern nations were drawn. And their culture, still alive in the quiet corners of Lusatia, tells the same story. Catholic rites sung in a language older than the churches themselves. Villages cradled in the green marshes of the Spreewald, where time seems to slow, and old Slavic traditions still dance in the spring festivals. Here, identity lingers, not in monuments, but in breath and song, in lineage. But history, as ever, is not kind to the stubborn, because for the Sorbs, the next chapters would bring more than conquest. They would bring a new fight, one not just for land, but for survival itself. Yet centuries of conquest would soon turn survival into resistance. They came first with swords. The year 939. A feast was called. Nobles summoned from across Sorbian lands. 30 princes, lords of their people, rode in under banners of peace. But this was no council, no negotiation. It was a trap. At the signal of Margrave Jarrow, the doors were barred. The princes slaughtered where they sat, their blood staining the floor, their voices silenced in a single day. From that moment, the long war for Sorbian identity began. German rulers would not stop at conquest of land. They sought conquest of the mind, of memory, of language itself. And so began the centuries of Germanization. Edicts issued, Sorbian banned from courts, from schools. Village names erased, replaced with German words. Scrolls burned. songs forbidden, children taught to forget the tongue of their ancestors. A war not of armies, but of culture. And yet, something strange happened. Even as the outward signs of Sorbian life were stripped away, beneath it all, a stubborn thread remained. In the blood. Modern DNA studies reveal it. Across 1,000 years of forced assimilation, the Sorbian genome barely shifted. Genetic markers distinct from their German neighbors, clusters still closest to Poles and Czechs. A quiet rebellion, written not in ink, but in the code of life itself. And in one of history's great ironies, the divisions of faith, meant to fragment them, instead gave them shelter. In Catholic villages, the old Slavic hymns survived. In Lutheran enclaves, the vernacular was preserved. The sword had failed. The scroll had failed. But those who sought to erase the Sorbs were not done yet. A new darkness was rising, one that would go beyond language, beyond law, and seek to rewrite the very essence of who they were. Because the darkest chapter was yet to come, one that targeted their very genes. It was not enough to silence their voices. The new regime wanted to erase the idea that the Sorbs had ever existed at all. Berlin, 1930s. In the heart of the Third Reich, a chilling doctrine was proclaimed. There's no Sorbian people. Just Germans, speaking a peculiar Slavic tongue. A dialect, they said, not an identity. And so, the machinery of erasure began. Books pulled from shelves, piled in the streets, set to flame. Schoolhouses shuttered. The Sorbian language, outlawed from the classroom, from public life. Villages stripped of their ancient names. Signs torn down. The land itself renamed. But this was not just cultural cleansing. It was something deeper. Plans were drafted, cold, meticulous. Mass deportation. Entire Sorbian communities marked for removal, to the mines, to the camps. Children separated from their families. Clergy and teachers arrested, silenced. And in thousands of homes across Lusatia, a terrible choice had to be made. Speak the old language and risk everything. Or bury it for the sake of your children. Many chose survival. Fathers who stopped singing the songs of their youth. Mothers who whispered lullabies in German. Surnames quietly changed. Family histories rewritten in silence. A generation grew up not knowing who they truly were. And the trauma of that erasure would echo down the bloodline. Even today, elders speak of the shame, the fear, the emptiness that remained long after the war. But history has a strange resilience. And what the Nazis tried to erase with fire and fear would one day resurface, in a place they never imagined. Not in books, not in flags, but in the deep code of the human body itself. Because modern science was about to expose what the Nazis tried to erase. The Nazis had burned the books, silenced the language, tried to erase the memory of an entire people. But there was one place their erasure could never reach. The blood. Decades after the war, in a sterile lab, far from the forests of Lusatia, scientists began to look closer, not at history books, but at genomes. And what they found defied every lie that had been told. When the DNA of modern Sorbian descendants was mapped, a pattern emerged. On the graphs, called PCA plots, most Germans clustered tightly together. A predictable genetic signature. But then an anomaly. A small, distinct cluster, drifting far from the German genetic center, and astonishingly closer instead to Poles, to Czechs, to the ancient heart of the Slavic world. Even after 15 centuries of borders shifting, of kings rising and falling, the blood still remembered. And it went deeper still. Within the Sorbian genome, rare markers, single nucleotide polymorphisms, appeared at unusually high rates. Genetic quirks, preserved through generations of isolation. Another clue, runs of homozygosity, long stretches of identical DNA, passed down from both parents. A sign not of weakness, but of endurance. A closed circle that had quietly resisted the currents of time. Each genetic signal told the same story. This was not a dialect, not a curious local tradition. This was a distinct people, whose origins reached deep into the Slavic migrations, and whose very blood now spoke the truth that centuries of oppression had tried to bury. A truth that no government, no ideology, could rewrite. But then came the question that still haunted the researchers. How How had this tiny community surrounded, persecuted, fragmented, resisted total assimilation? The answer lay not in the labs, but in the landscape and in the lives of those who still called Lusatia home. But how did this small population resist total assimilation? It looks like a fairy tale. A place of winding canals, dark green waters, ancient willow trees. This is the Spreewald, a labyrinth of marshland in eastern Germany, where roads give way to waterways and boats glide where cars cannot go. Here, a postwoman still delivers mail by barge, poling her wooden con through mist and morning light. But beneath the beauty lies a secret. For generations, this swampy wilderness was more than just home. It was a shield, a refuge for a hunted identity. As Germanization swept across Saxony, as Sorbian names were stripped from maps, these marshes became a fortress of culture. Hard to reach, easy to overlook, forgotten by the centers of power. And so the old ways lived on. Not openly, but in the folds of daily life. Each January, in villages cloaked by reeds and fog, a strange festival returns. Vogelhochzeit, the bird wedding. Children dressed as finches and crows, the wedding feast of pastries, shaped like birds, they're right older than the churches that now bless it. A living echo of pre-Christian fertility rites, carried forward beneath Catholic banners. At Easter, riders in black coats and top hats guide their horses through the fields, chanting hymns in Sorbian, blessing the land. To outsiders, it's quaint folklore. But to those who know, each ritual, each melody, is an act of defiance. A message passed from parent to child, when speaking Sorbian aloud could still mean persecution. Ironically, the very isolation that once marked this land as backward preserved it. Here in the marshes, language survived. Faith intertwined with identity. And even as the outside world modernized, the heart of a 1,000-year-old culture beat on, in rhythm with the slow pull of the river. But isolation can only hold so long. And now, in the modern era, new forces are rising. Forces that may yet finish what history began. Not all threats come with banners and armies. Some arrive quietly. A scholarship, a new job in the city, a one-bedroom apartment in Berlin or Dresden. For the first time in centuries, it isn't war or oppression that is drawing the Sorbian youth away. It's opportunity. And with each leaving train, another thread of the fabric begins to loosen. In the villages, the language once heard in every market, every church fades. Young couples, Sorb and non-Sorb, meet in universities, in workplaces. They fall in love. They marry. And with them comes a new generation. Children born of two worlds, often speaking German at home. Sorbian, if at all, only in the songs of their grandparents. On genetic maps, the shift is measurable. Where once the Sorbian genome clustered distinctly, a new gradient appears. Half-Sorbs, as researchers call them, now bridge the space between German and Slavic ancestry. A visible blending of bloodlines once fiercely preserved. But this is not just about DNA. It's about memory, about meaning. In villages where the bird wedding once drew every family, fewer children now know the old dances. In homes once filled with Sorbian hymns, the radio hums in German. Survival, now, means competing in a modern economy. And with that choice, culture is often the first thing left behind. A silent erosion, harder to resist than any decree or ban. Because when identity becomes inconvenient, it fades, quietly. No headlines, no protests. Just empty pews, empty language classes, empty spaces on the family tree. But even as the past seems to slip away, another shadow begins to rise. One that does not wear the mask of progress, but of old hatreds reborn. And politics, too, now stirs old dangers anew. The signs are subtle, at first. A new political poster in the town square. A familiar slogan, but with a sharper edge. In villages once safe for Sorbian voices, the new unease begins to stir. The AfD, Germany's rising far-right party, is gaining ground. And here, in the heart of Lusatia, their message is finding fertile soil. A message that whispers an old, dangerous question. Who belongs? In campaign speeches, in local debates, the rhetoric sharpens. Talk of real Germans. Of language, of blood, of culture. And for the Sorbs, a people who have survived 1,000 years of erasure, the echoes are unmistakable. Community leaders, elders who still remember the days when speaking Sorbian meant risking everything, hear the old notes returning. Not from the fringe, from the ballot box. Despite European protections, despite minority rights enshrined in law, the ground is shifting beneath their feet. In some districts, the AFD is now the strongest party. Elected voices questioning the value of bilingual education, of cultural subsidies, of the Sorbs themselves. Debates arise, once unthinkable. Should Germany define citizenship by blood? By ancestry? The language may be new, but for those who know this history, it feels chillingly familiar. A cycle once thought broken, now beginning again. And with each policy proposal, each nationalist chant at a rally, the question grows louder. How long before the quiet rights won after the war begin to slip away? In closed meetings, Sorbian activists warn of a cultural extinction. A final fading, not by force, but by the slow tightening of law and prejudice. And yet, in the face of this new identity war, not all is lost. For even now, in classrooms, in village halls, in whispered songs and public protests, acts of defiance are keeping the Sorbian flame alive. In a small kindergarten, the voices of children rise, but the words they sing are not German. They are Sorbian. The Unauthorized program, Welcome, is planting new roots in young minds. Here, language once nearly lost is spoken first, before German, before English. And for parents and grandparents, many of whom once whispered this tongue in secret, it is nothing short of a miracle. Across Lusatia, the fight for identity is shifting, not on battlefields, but in classrooms, in theaters, in the arts. Domowina, the great umbrella of Sorbian culture, now leads a new resistance, not of protest, but of presence. Festivals fill the streets once more. At Zampern, masked villagers parade from house to house, driving out the spirits of winter. In candlelit workshops, women trace intricate designs on Easter eggs, each symbol a story, a memory etched in color. Old men still walk the borders of ancestral fields, singing hymns beneath the sky unchanged for centuries. These are not quaint traditions. They are the DNA of a culture. And for the scientists who now study the Sorbian genome, this is the living counterpart. A people whose blood still carries markers of ancient Slavic migrations. A window into the deep history of Europe. But in the homes of Lusatia, the fight is not for academic insight. It is for the sound of a lullaby, passed from grandparent to child. For the choice of whether a young couple will teach their newborn in Sorbian, or let it fade. For the meaning behind a name, spoken with pride, or buried in the past. The stakes are deeply personal. And as the old voices gather once more in song, one question lingers in the air. A question no scientist, no politician, can yet answer. But will the next generation still speak with their ancestors' tongue? They called it a secret. Germany's darkest DNA secret. But in truth, the DNA was never the secret. The real secret was the attempt to erase them. The centuries of forced forgetting. The whispered lies that said the Sorbs were gone, or had never truly existed. Yet now the blood speaks. In every rare marker, in every strand of isolated code, the truth is there. Not as a relic, but as living proof. A people who endured not just through genetics, but through choice, through will. Because identity is not inherited by blood alone. It is carried in song, in language, in ritual, in memory. It is chosen again and again, with each new generation. And today, as the borders of Europe blur, even as new walls rise, the Sorbs remain. Fewer in number, but still here. Their story, not one of victimhood, but of resilience. And their DNA, a living bridge to the earliest Slavic migrations. A reminder that beneath every modern nation lie older truths, older voices, waiting to be heard. So in a world of fading borders and rising walls, what does it truly mean to belong? If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe for more untold stories. Because sometimes what we think we know is only the beginning.